So, the third in our series of introductions to the Bible before we start from tomorrow looking at those 66 books. I said at the beginning there were three things I wanted us to know before we look at those 66 books in the Bible. The first was that the Bible is a collection of different books and different kinds of literature. And then in the last video, we looked at how, as we consider the whole Bible, there are themes which run through the different parts of the scriptures. One story in two parts. And today, the third thing I want us to know is that if you start at the beginning of the Bible and read through to the end, quite frankly, it won't make sense. Well, what do you mean by that, Sam? Come on. What are you trying to say? What I'm trying to say is it won't make sense because it doesn't follow a chronological order. Normally, when you read a book, you start at the beginning and it traces things through until the end. And when you get to the end, you're at the end of the story. Well, the Bible doesn't quite work like that. It's more like this. Not like a lightsaber, but more like the Star Wars trilogy. Do you remember when it was just a trilogy? You know, great hairy creatures, big ones like Chewbacca and the small ones like Ewoks. I think the Ewoks didn't get enough of a showing, actually. But there was that initial trilogy, it told the story, and then over time, over decades, other episodes have been woven into that original trilogy to fill in some of the background, to fill in some of the bits in between those original episodes. And scripture works in that kind of a way as well. If you take the Bible, you'll find that the first few books actually do tell a coherent story. Genesis begins with the creation of the world, those first 11 chapters, which we'll be looking at tomorrow. It tells the story of the beginnings of the world, of humanity, and then it traces it through the beginnings of the nation of Israel. And then we get the story of how that nation is led into slavery in Egypt, how it's brought out of slavery a few hundred years later by Moses, how they settle in the promised land under Joshua, as things go on through the judges and they receive kings in Saul, and how David brings together the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and then how under Solomon there is a temple and the people of God live in the land that's been given to them, with the law that's been given to them, with a sign in circumcision that they are God's people, and with a temple, the place where God's glory dwells. But then shortly afterwards, the story starts to unravel. First of all, the northern kingdom disappears as it's conquered by Samaria in around 722. And then the southern kingdom, a couple of hundred years almost later, gets destroyed as the Babylonians take over Judah, the southern kingdom, from 597 onwards. That's the basic story. That's what the Old Testament, that first part of the story, takes us to. But what you get is a retelling of that story in the books of Chronicles, and then different prophets appear in different times in that story. Slightly unhelpfully, they're not even in chronological order. So you get prophets like Joel and Amos. They were talking to that northern kingdom before it was destroyed in 722. Some of the others, like Malachi and Isaiah, well, Isaiah is really complicated, as we'll see, but prophets like Ezekiel and Malachi, they were talking to the southern kingdom that was still around until 597 through to 586. So you see, you can't read it from the beginning to the end in that kind of a way. What you can be confident in, though, is of the basic story. This story from the beginning of the world, the formation of a nation, them being given their promised land, them losing everything. And then as they return from exile, with books like Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah and Daniel, trying to work out what it means now to live back in the promised land, having lost everything as they emerge into a new reality. How are they going to live? And so as we trace these 66 books through the Bible, we'll be thinking not just about what do they say, but where do they fit into this bigger story. So keep in mind these things, and it'll help us to understand that there's an overarching story here, and into it fit these different books at different times. And as we go through, I'll try and help you to understand how they fit together. It's one story, like the Star Wars stuff. It can be a bit confusing to follow the plot, but stick with it and it makes sense. And you'll see those overarching themes re-emerging again and again, knitting together this story. So there we go. We've heard a little bit about how there's 66 books in this one book, how there are two parts to one story, and how, with a little bit of understanding, we can see how the different books fit together in that overarching story. So, as Yoda might say, ready we are to go forward and look at these 66 books. From tomorrow, then, we'll start with Genesis and we'll continue all the way through until we hit the book of Revelation, sometime towards the end of July. Looking forward to journeying through with you.